Okay, we're on our 2008 server, and today we're going to set up the web server, Internet Information Services. And this will be similar to the way we set up Apache in our copy of Linux, Ubuntu, and Fedora. But there'll be a little bit less scripting involved, and it'll be a bit more graphical. This is our included web server with 2008 server. It's more robust than Vista and XP have a limited web server, but it's limited in its capacity to handle requests. It's really just for testing things out, so to speak, in a development environment. On the other hand, 2008 server has a much more full-featured and robust web server. Its version of Internet Information Services can handle a lot more throughput and bandwidth and simultaneous connections and things of that nature. But again, we want to add a server role, so I'm going to go to Server Manager. And as soon as we're done collecting data down here, okay, I'm going to go open up roles, and I'm going to say add a role. Add a role, add a sweet role, add a wheat role, add a yeast role. Add features required for web server IIS. And yes, okay, application programming interfaces. Go ahead and add the required features. And then I'm going to walk through the wizard. I want to say next, and next. And notice some of the options here. Active server pages if you want to do ASP.NET. CGI if you want to configure CGI scripts and application development. I kind of like running CGI scripts. And I a little bit like active server pages. But again, I'd have to add interfaces. Let's go ahead. Add required interfaces. And add required interfaces. We'll go ahead and add all this wonderful stuff here. Server-side includes. And in this case, you know, these could be banners or SSIs that go in with different pages. And let's go to a couple of other options here. Definitely want the management console, management scripts and tools. Throw those guys in. And let's go ahead and add the FTP server. We'll remember how we in Linux, Ubuntu, we added VSFTPD, the FTP daemon. Let's go ahead and do that here. And we'll the FTP server and management console. We'll go ahead and configure that as well. So now when we're done, we should have a working web server with Internet Information Services installed. We can go ahead and add our website, and we'll have an FTP server that will allow clients, we'll hop on our Vista client and create a FTP connection and try to, you know, send and retrieve some files. Now it's important to kind of remember some of the common ports when you're setting up all these services. Remember that for, you know, you may need to configure your firewall or allow incoming, outgoing, or you know, through traffic. So remember that for HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, you're going to need port 80 and also port 443 for SSL, Secure Sockets Layer. And that's with the Internet Information Services we're installing. For File Transfer Protocol, FTP, you're going to need ports 20 and 21. For DNS, you would need TCP and UDP ports 53. You know, just some of the commonly used ports. Telnet, if you're going to configure the Telnet service, you'd need port 23. 3389 for lightweight direct access protocol and NetBIOS, and something that you may want to consider when setting things up. The other thing, in addition to the proper ports being open to allow the service to operate properly, you'll need the appropriate permissions. So this will install a service account, which is sort of like a user account in Active Directory, but a service account is created for the purpose of a program to use it, whereas a user account would have been created for the purpose of a user to log in and do something. That service account, just like a user account, holds access control entries on DACLs for objects, discretionary access control lists. So one of the things that we'll need to do when we control permissions, if we set up things like directory browsing or virtual directories or shared folders, is configure the NTFS permissions and sometimes the web sharing permissions on those particular objects to control what you know, a web browser can and cannot do with our web server. Okay, we're on Server Manager, looking at roles now, and we've finished the IIS installation wizard. So let's go ahead and configure Internet Information Services and look at a few of its features. So again, I'm going to go to Administrative Tools, and there are two, you know, new options that I have here. IIS Manager I can use to configure Internet Information Services on the default website. Go ahead and load that. And then IIS 6.0 I can use to manage the FTP server. So first we'll look at this and we'll look at the default website. Let me go ahead and expand this. Push this over a little bit to the side. And here's our default website. Now I could come over here and right click and I could add new websites. And I could position the sites on different ports. I could have one web server serving out dozens of websites if that need be. And I could just change the port, or I could assign a different IP address if I had more than one bound to a single NIC, or if I had multiple NICs. In this case, in the physical path to the website. But we'll go with the default website, and let's just look at some of the settings here. Here are some .NET settings and controls. I can go to basic settings, and I can view virtual directories if I have any virtual directories set up. If I want to go to advanced settings, here are my advanced settings, enable protocols, connection limits. I can browse. Now, I haven't set up a web page yet, so it's just going to have that default IIS 7 web page. But this lets me know that Internet Information Services is functioning or working. And I'm going to go ahead and close that. Let's go down here and look at some of these settings. My active server page settings, and CGI settings, and one of the really important ones is authentication. Remember, I told you that it would add a service account, and in this case, anonymous authentication is enabled by default. So people don't really have to have a user ID or password to access the website. At least the material, so we're going to do a wiki website or just an information website. If I were to edit that, notice by default it's the iUser account, and that's the account you would use. You have to add that as, you'd have to add that as an access control entry to the DACL for a folder or object to give anonymous web access to a folder. If you want to let people, say browse a folder and directory browsing, or some other such thing. We could set that to a different user if we wanted, and then make that authenticated, force them to authenticate with a password. But in this case, it's iUser by default. CGI settings, default document. Notice that we can choose what the default document is. We can move it up or down. I'm going to move this up. And let me go ahead and move it up and up. And we'll make our index HTML page the first, our default document chosen by IIS as far as what to display. And then it would go in this order. If there wasn't an index HTML file in that folder, it would display default HTML, and if there wasn't that, default ASP, and so forth, all the way down. Directory browsing. Now this feature, normally by default, you will load, index.html, you'll load a default web page. But if you enable directory browsing on a virtual directory or other directory, then you can see files in that directory even if there is no index.html or HTML page. It's normally not a very secure feature, but sometimes it's what you want to do. If you want to, say, take files or the contents of what your FTP server is serving out and also make those files available to people with a web browser over HTTP, then directory browsing may be a useful feature. We will leave it turned off for the default website. Now we can customize our error messages if we want. So 404, and we can customize what they respond to, what they say. Let's see if there's anything else. Logging, output caching. Again, if we want to log, in this case, here's where our default log files are for people who access our web server, and that can be very useful if some, hanky-panky was going on your web server or something like that. Okay, so we've taken a look at that. Let's go look at the default web directory. Close that, close that. Web server directory over here, and I'm going to go here. And notice there's you'll notice a new subfolder or directory called inetpub, subdirectory from your root directory, and that's created when you install IIS. and that's where both your FTP and your website would be hosted. So FTP route would be here, and here's where you'd place your FTP files, and we'll throw some files in here. Make some files here. And that's just like when you remember from the root directory in Linux or Ubuntu, we went from var www, and then we had in www we had our web directories. Or you have your user's home directory for FTP. Here's our web directory, and here is where our default document is. And again, let me go ahead and enable viewing file extensions here. Uncheck that, yes. And this won't want to hide file extensions for known fault types. But you can see that was a default document. I'm going to create really quickly just a default HTML page, and we'll call this index.html. Remember, that was our preferred page in this directory. And I'm going to go here. And on the DACL, if I look at iUsers, notice it has read and execute by default. It's inheriting that from the parent, but again, it would need that permission in order for somebody to access our website anonymously. So I'm going to go ahead and open this with Notepad. That kind of give us our web page there, and then now I'm going to look at this from a local file system level, and that's what it looks like. But that's not actually going through our web server. Through our web server, what we want to do to test this out is let's open up our web browser, and we're going to type in HTTP, and you could use the loopback address 127.0.0.1, or you could just type in localhost. And let's have that secure. We'll just turn off the automatic phishing filter. And now notice I'm going through the loopback, and it's HTTP, so I'm actually going through Internet Information Services. And this is what I would see on, from any other client that was viewing this web page through my web server. And optionally, I could just say localhost. Okay. Now let's go ahead and close that, and let's load this across the network from let's log on our Vista workstation here. And we'll take a look at our Internet Information Services web server from the client or workstation side. And we just have a simple HTML page. No fancy active server pages or CGI going on or anything like that. No PHP yet, but so make sure that our web server has been set up properly. So I'm going to go ahead and launch Internet Explorer. And there are two ways to do this. I don't want to go out to the web, but I could type in the IP address or the host name of my server. So in this case, 192.168.100.100. There it is down there. And that's the IP address of Sarah. And we'll turn off automatic phishing filter. But there's our web page. So again, IIS is functioning. It's serving out our web page via the anonymous iUser account, IUSR account, across the network. Could be intranet or could be internet. Could be a public internet address. And again, synonymous with a domain name, in this case the host name of my web server, but I'm on an intranet right now, but if I were on the internet, that would simply be the domain name. And then my DNS server would point that HTTP request over port 80 to the appropriate hosts. So be able to resolve the host name to IP. Okay, back on our 2008 server, let's configure a virtual directory. So what I've done first, let's say we want to allow directory access. I've gone and I've created a directory on my file system. In this case, I've placed it inside of inetpub and www.root, and it's data. And there's some files in here I want to make available just as a directory listing. So I want to enable directory browsing, and I want this to be like a subdirectory off of my domain name or my website. So we'll need to configure a virtual directory and enable configure a virtual directory and enable directory browsing. And also we'll need to make sure that we have the appropriate permissions set up as an access control entry in the DACL for this folder. And by inheritance, it should be great. If you look here, you'll notice the iUser account has read permission. And if we need to give any other permission, full control or to modify the permissions, whatever permissions our web service or web page needed, maybe if we're running a script and it needs to write to the file system, that would need to be modified here under this account, IAS iUsers, and we can control the amount of permission, both inherited and whether or not it has write permission or full permission. In this case, we're only going to need read permission. We want to follow the principle of least privilege and don't give more permission than is necessary for good security, but we want read privileges to enable directory browsing on this folder, and this will need to be set up as a virtual directory. So let's go ahead and do that. We've opened up our Internet Information Services management console here. Let's open up here's our default website with our HTML page, and again, if we're going to browse, there's our default web page right there. So what I want to do is create a virtual directory, and I'm going to add a virtual directory, and I'm going to give it this. It doesn't have to be the same name, but I'll give it the same name as the physical file system name. Makes things easier to remember and associate in the administration process. And I want to select data. So here's the physical path: c:\inetpub www root data. But this is all that's going to be. If I type in my website name and then /data, this is how it will be accessed as a virtual directory. I have a couple of other options here. I can connect as a specific user, and I could set the user account and password protect that virtual directory. I'm going to use the application user, which again is that iUser account. And I'll test settings, and should get a green and a warning message authorization. In this case, it's just letting me know, hey, I haven't tested that iUser account. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. When I do, data will appear here under my default website. And what I want to do also is I want to go down here and I want to configure, well actually, before I set up directory browsing, which is right here, notice that it's, actually it was set up. Let me disable that and show you what it looks like, or what it would look like if I did not have directory browsing enabled and I didn't have a default document in that folder, like no index.html or default ASP or something like that. So we'll go ahead and load up our web browser, localhost, and now if I try to go to data, notice it's forbidding me access because there's no default document, and that's just a good security feature. You wouldn't want directory browsing enabled on most of your folders, most of your virtual directories, but occasionally you might want to enable it. In this case, we're not going to put anything in this directory that is sensitive information or that we're afraid for prying eyes to see. So we'll go ahead and turn directory browsing on. I'm going to go over here. I'm just going to click on Enable. And when I do that, let me close this or minimize it. Now I'm going to reload that directory. And now you can see, now you can actually browse the files through the web browser. Here's Fiddle Faddle and Horse Feathers and Poppycock and stuff and other types of files there. But this would be useful, again, if maybe you had a dual FTP server /web server and you wanted to make all of your FTP files available, that you make available for download from your FTP server, also available over HTTP to your web browsing clients, then you could set up directory browsing on the FTP root folder. Sometimes that's what seems like a popular solution that a lot of people do. So there is our website.